Hi, welcome to valuationpodcast.com, a podcast and video series about all things related to business and valuation. My name is Melissa Gragg, and I provide online divorce mediation and valuation services in St. Louis, Missouri. Today, we will discuss expert witness integrity and neutrality in litigation with Zachary Meyers, a CVA and CPA in Winfield, West Virginia. He's testified and been qualified as an expert in the forensic accounting, taxation, business valuation, pension valuation fields specific to civil, marital, and criminal litigation. It touches on an issue that there's a nuance in valuation, that there is a different, we have two ways that we can do it under a certain designation, the CVA, which we both have. And you can look at any valuation as a calculation of value or a conclusion of value. And so maybe you can kind of give us a little bit of background of what are the key differences in those two ways of doing evaluation.
Sure. Well, under the NACVA standards, we'll preface it with that. There are two different ways to estimate value or to provide an estimate of value. One is a valuation, and the other type is a calculation. The primary difference between a valuation and a calculation is that in a valuation, you're looking at all three approaches, the asset, income, and market approach, and you're literally performing all the procedures, additional procedures. But with a calculation, you're performing usually specific procedures agreed upon between you and the client, and it's limited. It's usually significantly less procedures, and sometimes maybe even one approach, as opposed to the three approaches in evaluation. And so it's restricted professional judgment is probably the best way to put it. But in a litigation setting is where it really, really takes off, because in a litigation setting, most of the time, a valuation is going to be nine times out of 10. If you can do a full valuation, you need to do it. You have to have a reason to do the lower form of calculation. Generally speaking, you're not going to get very many opportunities to do that, with the exception of some sort of limitation of time, data, or financial resources that causes you to have to perform a calculation as opposed to a full-blown valuation.
Well, and I think that, a lot of times people will say, well, I want to just do this cheaper, right? Or I don't need everything. I don't need a full-blown. Can you just run some numbers? Can you back of the envelope? All of those things that we've heard 100 different times. But is the calculation of value really much cheaper, first of all? Or second of all, is there really just certain reasons that you would use a calculation versus a conclusion?
Well, to answer your first question, generally it can be cheaper, but it's normally not that much cheaper. Mm-hmm. And depending on complications, it can be every bit as expensive as a valuation. It just depends. I've seen calculations get blown out of proportion. But when you're talking about the instances where a calculation is even plausible, let's just start off with that. Generally, in the litigation setting, a calculation is only plausible if you have to do it, in my opinion. And I say that because if you are in a adversarial litigation setting where you have another opposing expert on the other side of you who can perform a valuation or a calculation or what have you, and that estimate of value is going to be compared to whatever you put out. If you put out a calculation and the opposing expert puts out a valuation, you may have just accidentally put your client in a weaker position. It's not always the case, but generally speaking, if you have a self-imposed scope limitation embedded in your calculation and the other expert doesn't, a lot of times judges are going to put more weight towards the opposing expert's valuation. So generally speaking, the only times I would say that you could even think about a calculation is if you have a limitation that's uncontrollable, like the data or the financial resources or time. And those are very, those are kind of touch and go things. If you're talking about data, that's something that we've seen with the pandemic. We've seen a whole lot of limitations of the limitation of the reliability, access to the data. Sometimes the data doesn't even exist. I've had cases that, I had a case probably about 3 or 4 years ago where a guy was in prison for like 9 years, and the wife, after he got out of prison, they were still married, and the wife wanted a divorce, and she was making an argument for dissipation of the marital estate because basically the business that he had operated had been running fraudulently and basically made money off of bribery and things like that. And so I had to go back and try to determine what, if any, value was dissipated in his particular instance, because the wife was making a dissipation of the marital estate argument, basically saying that had he not done these fraudulent things, the marital estate would be worth more. But in order to do that, I had to go back and take a look at performing a valuation or an estimate of value that dated back 10 years. And sometimes when you're going back that long, and you'll have the same situation if you have like gifting of stock or other situations where you're looking at the separate property appreciation or things like that, when you have to do multiple valuations or like a before and after valuation, sometimes you're not going to have the data. Sometimes you'd have to like rebuild a balance sheet in order to even look at an asset approach, for example. Sometimes you'll have a client that just has nothing but Schedule Cs. In that particular case that I did with the guy that got out of prison, I had to back out all of the fraudulent, illegal, felonious income. And it ended up showing that, like, basically I couldn't do an asset approach because I'd have to rebuild the balance sheet. Couldn't really do a market approach because there's not really a bunch of market multiples for felonious businesses out there. And so I basically was stuck with doing like periodic income approaches. And that was basically a calculation. And I before I did it, I talked to my attorney or my client. They talked to their client. We talked to the court. We talked to the opposing expert, who ended up not even doing any sort of valuation or calculation. They basically just went with my number. And so I made it a multilateral decision as opposed to a unilateral decision. I didn't just do it by myself. I didn't take it upon myself just to put it out there. I made sure all the parties were in agreement that, hey, we don't have very many other things that we can do. And generally that would be the type of situation where a calculation may be okay when you don't have any other choice. But if you do it out of preference, that's a whole nother thing. A lot of times before I wrote the Pink Elephant in the Courtroom article, or even this Unimpeachable Treatise article, I know you see it too. You would see people that perform calculations in a litigation setting in a disingenuous way. We can pretend like that doesn't happen, but it does. So a lot of times what you'll see is people that decide to perform a calculation in a litigation setting in order to control the inputs and better control the outputs, or the estimate of value that is most financially advantageous to whoever retains them. And that's absolutely just not appropriate, just completely. There's nothing unimpeachably neutral about doing that whatsoever. And the problem was we weren't really giving anybody any guidance as to when we could or should or shouldn't do a calculation in a litigation setting. It's always just been, you can't do it on one side, and then the other side's like, yeah, you can do it, but we're not going to really tell you when you can do it.
Right.
I've always thought that was inappropriate. So in addition to the articles that I've written, the NACVA Standards Board has put out some phenomenal, I have to give a shout out to the entire NACVA Standards Board, who put out some phenomenal Q&As, or I'll call them interpretations, is what I like to call them. Sounds better. But Rob Carter, Josh Warren, Nick Mears, and the whole team, they just did a fantastic job of putting the final touches on the standard interpretations, which get into the very subject of when a calculation is or may not be appropriate in a litigation setting, among other topics. And especially during the pandemic, I thought it was very timely.